for coming, everyone, and very good evening to you. I'm here today to talk about SolarWinds, the breach that occurred, a quick overview of the Sunburst malware, and more importantly, sort of give a timeline of what happened. So a little bit about me here. I'm George Glass. I'm the head of threat intelligence at RedScan. Used to work in defense, finance, some time in e-commerce as well. RedScan is a MDR provider, penetration testing provider. We have offices in Nottingham and London, and some very good news recently. We've just been acquired by Kroll, so some very exciting times at RedScan at the moment. But that's enough of that. Let's get into some espionage. So I'm going to go over the SolarWinds breach very quickly. There's a lot of information to cover, so there won't be an awful lot of technical detail, but there is time for questions at the end if you have any specific questions you'd like to ask. I'm also assuming that you're fairly familiar with what the SolarWinds product is. It's a network monitoring tool, and we'll be talking about SolarWinds as an organization and the Orion product itself. So what happened? According to SolarWinds and their digital forensics team and partners, we know that a threat actor gained access to their environment on the 4th of September 2019. Now that's more than a year before we got the notification. So that just goes to show the sort of timescales we're dealing with here. We don't know currently the method of initial access. What we do know is that the threat actor that gained this access was extremely cautious and moved very quickly to gain a very high-level overview of the network. On September the 12th, so just over a week or so since gaining initial access, the threat actor began testing, adding code to the SolarWinds Orion build server. This is the server that bundles the packages and ships it off for customers. So a very, very high value target, and one that would allow the threat actor to push code to over 18,000 customers. So this sort of goes to show that the value of supply chain attacks, and there have been many over the years. CCleaner springs to mind, Moonwalker back in the 90s. These types of attacks can be extremely powerful for espionage operations. And the two I mentioned previously were conducted by Russia and China. So typically these sorts of things are a product of statecraft and are used for cyber espionage activities. On the 20th of February, the Sunburst malware was deployed. So this is the malicious DLL file that was added to the build server to be pushed out to all of those clients. The malware itself is able to persist and survive reboots. It's extremely well crafted and is crafted specifically to do everything it possibly can to avoid detection. And it does this in a number of ways. One of those ways is by doing absolutely nothing for 2 weeks. So if you have a staging environment, for example, you're not going to see it because, let's be honest, who stages for 2 weeks? It would only deploy on systems that it thought it could get away with. So there are certain elements of the code that would not permit the malware to deploy if it thought it was in a sandboxed environment, for example, or if it noticed certain IP addresses. The malware itself was used to drop a custom and heavily modified version of the Cobalt Strike penetration testing framework. And this is what the threat actors use to initiate hands-on keyboard activity. In July, we started seeing warning signs that something was wrong in the SolarWinds environment. Voxlisty in July noticed that there was some suspicious activity surrounding some SolarWinds builds that they'd seen in the wild after they'd been asked to do instant response. But they chose not to disclose that information to SolarWinds themselves, because they didn't have enough evidence to suggest that it came directly from the SolarWinds box itself. Maybe it was used for lateral movement. All of these things are sort of a little bit up in the air, but this is one of the earliest signs that we had that something could have been awry in the wild. As consumers, as people that own SolarWinds products, this was maybe one of the earliest warning signs that we could have got that something was wrong. Interestingly, just prior to these sorts of detections by VoxListT, the threat actors had removed the malware from the build server. So this means that the malware would no longer be deployed if someone went to apply a patch or a hotfix, for example, and it's the first signs that the threat actor has started to cover their tracks. And we can kind of think, okay, well, that's very interesting. They're trying to cover their tracks, but at the same time, they've had access to people's build servers, people's environments since sort of February, March time. So a few months there, and the thinking around that is that they've used that time to initiate hands-on keyboard activity, again remaining extremely stealthy since no one noticed, and they've now got the targets they want. They've identified the targets they want to go after, and they don't really care about anyone else, and they don't want to get caught. So they started removing the malware from the build server at about that time. In December of 2020, FireEye initially reported that it was a victim of a nation-state attack. And at the time, this report was fairly vague, just that FireEye had been impacted by some sort of data breach, and that more information would follow shortly. So my threat intelligence team, at this time, we really pricked our ears up. FireEye getting hacked, that's a really pretty big deal. We knew that this was obviously a very serious attack to breach FireEye, and that something potentially larger may be going on. We got that information just about a week later, where FireEye joined the dots. They used their telemetry data to show that they were attacked when the point of entry being the SolarWinds Orion product. And they initiated a dialogue with SolarWinds to inform them that the FireEye and potentially many other customers of SolarWinds were a victim of a supply chain attack. This particular supply chain attack as well seemed to be extremely targeted, although they didn't know that at the time. But as we now know, the threat actor was mostly going after government departments and defense contractors, education departments, and anything to do with national infrastructure as well. But we'll cover that in a little bit. One of the interesting tidbits about this actually is that the FireEye breach was actually detected after a user received a two-factor reset notification to their phone. That was the point of discovery, and that person's thought, well, I haven't initiated a two-factor reset, so I'm going to report this. So that's a really good example of how proper training and security posturing can alert you to something that maybe you haven't written detections for, or you don't have the capability to detect. So a very interesting tidbit there. On the 14th of December, SolarWinds files a SEC report and begins notifying its users. And this is where the drip feed of information really starts to begin. As we learn more and more about the attack, we understand what's potentially happening, and it allows people in the industry to start reacting to what's going on far better. It was about this time that we in ResScan, we picked up copies of the Sunburst code that had been released, and we started to try and understand the domain generation algorithm that was used in that particular piece of malware. Now, I won't bore you with all the details, but from that and from some very fancy tools that were released on GitHub, we were able to identify potentially some of the domains that were used in this attack, deliberately so that we could, if for instance any of our customers were in that breach, luckily not, but so we could understand the scale of the attack. And it was at this point that we started to realize, okay, this is really very serious. We're seeing some very big names in here. We're seeing .gov, .edu domains in there, and so we started to understand, the scale of this was pretty massive. The day after that, some victims were officially named by the US government, we understood that the timeline of the attack stemmed from the update that came out from SolarWinds in March. So at this point, we already knew, okay, so threat actors could have been in an environment for about 6 months. That's an incredibly long time for something to happen. But not only that, they're a cyber espionage group and a nation state operation. So they're going to be extremely hard to find. And again, the scale of this thing is starting to dawn on us. There's a hell of a lot of work to be done in the next few days and weeks to fully understand exactly what's happened here. The number of victims at this point was mostly limited to very big names. So we had we've already had FireEye, some Microsoft domains were in that list as well, but mostly US government departments. And at this point, we need to start joining the dots. And in threat intelligence, we try to perform attribution where possible. And we started to think about nation states that would do this, and two came to mind straight away, and that being China and Russia. And we knew that there were a number of Chinese operations that used supply chain attacks and a limited amount of Russian ones as well. So at this point, we're still trying to join the dots together. As we continue through December, more and more big names are coming up, more government departments. And it was on the 19th of December that Russia was accused of performing this attack. 200 government departments impacted, and the first sort of official denouncement of Russia for performing these attacks. Although we don't know the particular advanced persistent threat group that was using it, the particular department in the Russian intelligence agency that was performing these attacks, we know that this can be attributed to Russia, and we can narrow down the tactics, techniques, procedures that those particular threat actors use to better perform threat hunting across environments. So again, attribution is extremely hard, but it's extremely useful for threat intelligence and threat hunting teams when we know that there's potentially been an impact upon a client environment, for example, and we need to go looking to find signs of exactly what's happened. It really narrows down the search quite significantly. On the 31st of December, we learned that not only was Microsoft amongst those that had been alerted to the breach, and that we knew that there was some activity within Microsoft, but we then learned that the Microsoft source code repositories, some source code repositories were breached, which was at the beginning a huge cause for concern. Once we find out that potentially operating systems, exchange servers, although that's another very interesting topic, have been breached, we need to start adjusting threat models appropriately to prepare for the fact that there could potentially be further supply chain attacks using Microsoft infrastructure as well, which would be absolutely catastrophic, to be honest. But we were preparing for the worst at this point because information was still very limited at this time. We also learned that the operation in the SolarWinds environment could date back more than a year to, at that time, it was suggested that it would be October 2019. Again, we knew that this was a very advanced attacker, but to persist in an environment for that long takes serious skill, serious dedication, a lot of time, and we really started to get an idea of the particular threat actor that we were dealing with at this point. Following that, there was a joint statement by the FBI, CIISec, ODNI, NSA, the NCSC as well issued a statement around this time, again reinforcing the fact that this was a Russian operation and that all of the allied organizations would be working together to mitigate and prevent further intrusions of this type. a pretty serious amount of egg on face for these organizations. Supply chains attacks are extremely difficult to detect and respond to, but there's again a hell of a lot of work, a lot of money being spent in remediating this, and so there's a lot of questions that need to be answered very quickly, and these sorts of joint statements certainly help, especially with organizations that may not have such direct access to the government's help. It really helped in remediation and mitigation efforts on our side as well. More guidance was given for detecting and responding to these breaches as well. This is more of the sort of the trickle down of the tools that can be used to detect and respond to these particular types of attack for organizations that were impacted. And on the 29th of January, SolarWinds issued a security advisory. We're mostly talking about Supernova today, but during the DFIR process, the few months that they'd had to perform digital forensics and some instant response, another form of malware was discovered in the SolarWinds platform as well. That's namely Supernova, which was operated by Chinese threat actors. So again, at this point, we're also getting an idea of some of the third-party risks that can be introduced with using some of these software providers. There are two threat actors in this very expensive product, and my organization is now at risk from two nation states. So again, a more drip feeding of information as the DFIR process continues, but we're building up a pretty good picture of exactly what's happening here, and the sort of problems that we might be dealing with. If you weren't already on a high alert footing beforehand, we certainly are now, knowing that there's at least two threat actors in this company's environment. There are some congressional hearings on the 23rd of February. Many organizations that were impacted testify, basically explaining what's happened, how they helped remediate the breach. There's some back and forth between certain companies about exactly who's to blame and exactly what happened. I personally followed it very late at night, and yeah, to be honest, it was fairly frustrating, I must say. There's a lot of sort of sharp elbows in that particular hearing, but again, a lot of useful information was shared, and we got further information that wasn't that didn't come to light previously as well. The day after, there was a further SolarWinds advisory. This was accompanied by even more tools to help organizations identify if they had been directly impacted by this breach. It gave some more information of how to remediate, what particular items to look out for, particular network activity to look out for. I think it was about sort of in this sort of general time period that it was discovered that a lot of the network activity that the threat actor was using was masquerading as legitimate SolarWinds telemetry data, making it almost impossible to hunt for some of these particular indicators of compromise. And we're getting into March of 2021 now, and there's I don't want to say a devolvement of the geopolitical situation, but things are certainly hotting up between Russia and the Western world at this time. And there's been some saber rattling, to say the least. At this point, the DHS announced that the threat actors have accessed Department of Homeland Security emails after the hands-on keyboard activity that was detected in their environment, and they also had access to cybersecurity staffers. These particular staffers were directly involved in the investigation to catch this particular threat actor. So again, we're seeing the scale of the breach, the clandestine nature that the the threat actors following, and their ability to recover vast amounts of information about the response and remediation methods that an entire government uses. So as a piece of spycraft, this is absolutely phenomenal. You really couldn't hope for anything better than this, to be honest. As I said, the geopolitical situation seems to worsen, especially over the last few weeks. And there is a UK statement on the 15th of April directly linking SolarWinds activity and other cyber espionage activities over the last 5 years or so to APT29, which is the SVR branch of the Russian intelligence services. We've been tracking APT29 campaigns for quite some time, but this is the first official confirmation that it came from directly from this particular threat actor. And on the same day, the US imposes sanctions with those that are involved with APT29 and some military personnel, and expels diplomats from embassies as well. This was followed by a number of other countries, the Czech Republic, for example, I think Bulgaria as well. And it just goes to show, you know, throughout this whole time, there was a lot of saber rattling. There's the cyber Pearl Harbor, some people were calling it. Certainly not a direct act of war. I would describe it as an act of cyber espionage. But again, a lot of egg on faces, and this is one of the first times that we've seen the US government really impose sanctions in direct, as a direct consequence of a cyber operation such as this. It's not designed to stop it happening in the future. It's just designed to frustrate and delay some of these operations going forward. And I think there's still going to be some fallout in the next few months. We've been saying this for some time. DFIR operations take a long time, and a breach of this scale will really take many months, if not years, to fully understand the impact. So I think there's a lot more to be said about this. It's an incredibly interesting topic, and we've got a hell of a lot of information to go through, and probably more to come. I'll just take a quick moment if you'd like to view some more of the intelligence work that we do at RedScan. I recently did a first quarter review of what we are seeing in the wild, and SolarWinds was formed part of that review. And maybe a little bit more recent, we recently did a webinar on proxy log on the Exchange vulnerabilities. So there's some more information there if you want to go and check those out. If you want to get a hold of me, absolutely feel free. On Twitter, I'm there as IMG. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can send me and my team an email at threat.intelligence@redscan.com. But I think that's it for me. I ran a little bit over, so maybe we could take a couple of questions if there are any. But thank you very much for listening. Cheers.
Thank you, George. We have 2 questions. Just before we start, invite everyone to submit their questions via the Q&A panel whilst George is answering these 2 questions. So first up is from Andrew. Andrew asks, are our firewalls ineffective against foreign nation states? If so, why? Do we attack their countries in a similar fashion as a counterattack?
Was the first part of that question, are firewalls effective or ineffective?
Ineffective.
Ineffective. So that's a very good question. Advanced persistent threats or nation states have almost unlimited funding and all the time they need to directly impact an organization they want to impact. If they can't get in through the firewall, they will drop a USB outside your office. They'll pay an employee. If they want to get inside an environment, there's a very good chance they will. So I think it's a case of making sure there's enough detection and response capability inside your environment, a defense in depth approach to purchasing these pieces of equipment, and allowing yourself to realize that there's a number of attack paths and attack modes into an organization, and there's no one sort of golden goose solution to any of these. It's a combination of that good training and detection technology as well.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Peter. He asks, is it reasonable to assume that Microsoft products are now vulnerable?
So that's a very good question. The Microsoft source code that was breached was viewed, but because of the access controls that Microsoft had in place, code could not be pushed to that repository. And because Microsoft's policies do not allow API keys or code to be pushed into that particular environment, this I think was another staging server that they were looking at. I think it's safe to assume that Microsoft products in this particular case have not been directly impacted by the attackers from SolarWinds. Now, there's a lot to be said about other various zero-day vulnerabilities that have been discovered and things like that. And you know, a really good example of that is the recent Exchange servers, vulnerabilities in Exchange servers. There's always reasons to keep up good patching protocol. There will always be 0 days. It's just trying to stay on top of that. And again, defense in depth, etc., etc. I won't repeat myself too much, but there's you know, a number of different things that could potentially impact an environment. I don't think that SolarWinds attackers breaching a read-only code base in Microsoft is the worst thing to worry about.
Great. Next question is from Steve. What made the initial attack so successful in your view? The patience and the time taken before carrying out any activity rather than the code or malware itself?
I'd actually say it's a combination of all of those. The threat actors clearly moved very quickly once they had initial access to the environment. They immediately identified a build server and started to push code directly to it. So they were inside an environment and pushing code to a target build server and testing on that build server for several months. Not only that, they were using customized versions of Cobalt Strike in such a way that you know, it thwarted detection from many leading cybersecurity companies. It's staggering. It's one of the biggest pieces of cyber spycraft that I've ever seen. It's you know, it's really impressive, to be honest. It's very impressive, and you know, there's a lot to be said for detection opportunities inside the SolarWinds environment. There maybe were some ways that could have been detected before it got pushed to the build servers, air gapping the build server, all of these things. But the fact that they were operating for such a long time without being detected is amazing.
Okay. Next question is, I'm in the US. All the news coverage I've seen has been about US-based companies and US government departments. Were there any entities breached in this attack in the UK and other countries too?
Yes, I think there were a couple of UK companies, I think some energy providers, and from the top of my head, I think there were some Australian companies impacted as well. A lot of the later DFIR work didn't specify the companies that were directly involved. Obviously, we know that the backdoor was pushed to everyone that patched since between March and June of 2020. So technically, any customer that did is impacted, but the DFIR work that I've seen hasn't really focused much on those. It's mostly been US targets, to be honest.
Okay, right, we've got time for one more. We'll save the rest of the questions until after all of the speakers have spoken.
Sure.
So the final question for you, George, is would you say that SolarWinds hack is a modern day Stuxnet?
Yes, that's a very good comparison to draw. And actually, I think I missed a piece of another question about whether we do similar things to other countries, and I think Stuxnet is an example of that. There's certainly a lot of it going around. Stuxnet, again, a genius piece of cyber espionage, but again, that was a directly damaging attack. It was designed to destroy uranium enrichment plants in Iran. And the way that they got that there was by dropping USB sticks outside and gaining initial access that way. So yes, a very specific piece of malware designed to do a very specific thing. Yes, I think that's a really good comparison to draw, yes.
Great, thank you, George.
Sarah. So yeah, my name's Darren James, and yeah, as we've just been talking about, we're going to be talking about the Sunburst issue today. But from my perspective, we're going to be looking at what we can do as systems administrators, because I'm as well as being a technical lead at Spec Ops and a product specialist at Spec Ops, I also look after their internal systems as well. And Spec Ops is a security company, IT software security company. And this sort of thing is very important to us because, especially with our software, we actually install components on domain controllers and process passwords and password resets. So obviously we're fundamental to a lot of the security issues that could be arisen by something like this. So hopefully I can give you a perspective of an IT administrator, but also of a security software vendor and what companies like us are hopefully doing to avoid these sorts of situations in the future. Who am I? I've worked in IT for probably 25 plus years now. I specialize in Active Directory, Azure AD, and group policy. I've worked with hundreds of customers all over the world, all different shapes and sizes, from governments to energy companies. And yeah, worked at Spec Ops for the last 10 years. I was very impressed with their software when I met them at a TechEd conference back in Berlin all those years ago. And here I am still working for them now. So yeah, it's good stuff. So a couple of headlines. Highly evasive attacker leverages SolarWinds supply chain to compromise multiple global victims with Sunburst backdoor. And Microsoft, their statement, SolarWinds attack highlights growing sophistication of nation state actors. And George has done a fantastic job in timelining that entire process. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time covering it now, but just as a quick reminder, yep, SolarWinds Orion is a network server and monitoring solution. It's got 33,000 active customers across all sectors. And it's very important for SolarWinds themselves. 45% of their annual income comes from the recurring revenue of that subscription. And it's often run under an admin context to kind of give the information that monitoring system requires. It's run as an admin. So pretty invasive potentially if it got into the wrong hands. What happened? Again, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but yes, nation state sponsored attack, supply chain based, could have been in place since October 2019 and wasn't really discovered until December 2020. Potentially over 18,000 customers affected. So those are people that downloaded patches around between those times. And yes, major software vendors were also affected. Their source code may have been compromised, or at least vulnerabilities found, which could theoretically be exploited in the future. So this is a massive deal, as George quite rightly pointed out. So how does it affect me as the IT admin? What do I need to do? So, well, first of all, although this arrived as a form of a patch, really we still need to make sure that we have good patching mechanisms, not just for our operating systems, but also for the software and systems that we use on those servers as well. And that includes our firewalls. You know, every piece of equipment, you should try and make sure you get that up to date as soon as possible. And I know that's no small task, but it really does need to be an area of focus. Antivirus definitions, yeah, you know, we're always playing catch up to malware and hackers. There are always new forms of antivirus coming out. Sorry, virus and malware coming out, but we still do need to maintain a higher level of awareness when it comes to antivirus definitions and making sure that they're up to date. Because if it's not the latest attacks that we're protected against, it's certainly those replay attacks that come from borrowed or stolen code from this malware when it becomes freely available. So we still want to make sure that we can try and catch those variants. And, you know, are you directly affected? I got a quote from someone saying, you know, this isn't just patch and change your password like we've seen in the past. This is really, especially if you're a customer, assume breach, and then it's really perform a hunt and an eviction process. So this means that you need to, you know, block those outbound connection, those URLs that this malware was reporting back to. There's a list of those on the Microsoft website. You need to check your AD accounts or your Active Directory or your other directory services that you may use for unusual accounts, because again, we don't know how long people have been in there, what credentials they've managed to capture, whether they've created other backdoors into your environments. So you really need to sort of understand, you know, what accounts you've got. Are they the right accounts? Disable any unused accounts or unrecognized accounts. Make sure your admin accounts are limited and all recognized to and linked to proper personnel. So this is all, again, important stuff. Check your firewalls. Again, the admin accounts for access to firewalls may have become compromised. There might be some strange rules in there that you're not aware of. So make sure that they're all up to date. Maybe even go back, if you've got backups, go back a few revisions to compare those before you make any drastic changes. Check servers for unusual local accounts. So again, it might not be directory based or AD based. They could have created backdoor accounts on local servers as well, so local admin accounts. So it's about checking for those sorts of accounts as well, or that kind of attack as well. And also unusual processes. Check scheduled tasks. We saw, particularly with the proxy logon systems, a couple of our customers noticed that there were some batch files being run about half an hour after a reboot. So you'd reboot the server, your Exchange server or whatever it might be. It spins up, everything seems fine for about half an hour, and then later on a scheduled task would run and then start unloading illicit code again. So, you know, be careful for that. It was a hidden scheduled task that was causing that problem. And then really, you know, you're only as strong as your weakest vendor. It's a bit of a strange quote, but you know, you need to look into who's supplying your software, who's supplying your services. Are they outsourcing their code development anywhere? Have you done a security audit on their practices, on their employment practices, how their coding practice, their development practices, their release practices? So it all really shines a spotlight on, it's not just another piece of software that you buy off the shelf anymore. You really need to dig into who the vendor is and their development practices, and then go from there. So it does make our lives a little bit tougher as IT admins. We do need to look into purchases of new systems and software in a lot more detail and try and gain confidence from those suppliers to make sure that they're doing things properly. So what next? Well, yeah, I've just really talked about this, haven't I? Due diligence of future software should always be performed. Sorry. So ask the vendor about their documentation when it comes to development processes, security vetting, making sure any code that they install is signed. We do this particularly for on our software that we install on our domain controllers. It's all actually signed by Microsoft, so it's not going to set off any smart screen or raise any flags when it comes to antivirus. You should ask for maybe for a summary page or full penetration test. That's independent penetration test that those software companies have performed on themselves. And again, it's not just the service that they're providing, especially if it's a SaaS service or a cloud-based service. We are interested in that, obviously, becoming compromised, but also their own internal servers, their own sort of mouse servers, their IT infrastructure. Do they have any penetration testing results that they can share with you on that to give you the confidence that they're doing things properly? And also come up with a security questionnaire. We get these a lot now, asking about, how do they perform updates? How do they perform backups? How do they notify customers of security breaches? What processes do they have in place to make sure that if the worst does happen, they're on top of it and they can get back to a secure state again? Once you do have software, or once you have an idea of the software that you want to buy, you really need to test it thoroughly and provide a security review in your own environment. So only open the required URLs and IPs and ports that's needed. Monitor any outbound traffic from that new software over a period of time. Trace where it's going back to. Is it going back to those legitimate URLs that software vendor told you about? Or is some of that traffic being blocked from that server that you've just installed that new service on? And maybe leave it in a kind of quarantine state for at least 2 or 3 weeks before you go live with it. Consider an alternative vendor. So if there is another vendor that produces similar software that's going to meet your business requirements, maybe look at them as well. So you've got two to compare against. And we're not just talking about whether you're saving money on costs, but again, what their security stance is when it comes to developing their software. And of course, the internet's a wonderful thing, but we need to be aware of any free tools that we find on GitHub and other repositories around on the internet, because unless you're skilled at reading that code, you don't really know what you're downloading. So be careful of what's out there and what's available for free. It might not be as free as you think. So these are important things to bear in mind. What else can we do? Well, yeah, I mean, I would say this, I work for a password policy company, but yeah, review your password policy. Passwords, unfortunately, are still going to be with us for quite some time. So make sure all your users have got good ones. Make sure they don't reuse them. Maybe look at switching to using things like passphrases instead of passwords. So go for long, strong passwords rather than short but complex passwords. Obviously, if you've got multi-factor authentication available for any systems that you have in place, switch it on. There's no reason why you shouldn't these days. Near enough everybody's come across some sort of MFA even in their personal lives. So there's no reason not to switch it on in a corporate environment. But don't forget, though, that MFA isn't always the answer to everything, especially when you're looking at systems like Windows Hello. It's really, that's just a convenience thing more for the user. It doesn't really protect your passwords. There's still a password underpinning that. So you still need to make sure that you've got good password protection, even if you've got MFA enabled. And of course, we often find that you can't enable MFA everywhere. So if there's still a password that's used for one system, that is still a chink in your armor potentially. So, yeah, again, make sure you've got good password policies. And obviously block weak and leaked passwords and everything else. Consider introducing a privileged access management solution. We don't sell that, but I still think it's a great idea. So rather than having admin accounts all the time for users, find a system that allows your admin accounts to check out, or admins, I should say, to check out an admin account that will be available for an hour with a randomly generated password. They do their work, and then that account is then deleted. And that way you've not got admin accounts loitering on your system that aren't being used very frequently and therefore vulnerable to attack. Also look at maybe using things like managed service accounts as well. So rather than you creating, whenever a new service goes into play, rather than you creating a user with a password that never expires, try and make use of the Microsoft Managed Service Accounts feature if that software supports it, or look at one of the third-party solutions that enables Active Directory in the application to manage that account and manage a frequent change of that password over the lifetime of that application. When we're talking about passwords as well, make sure your users use secure vaults. So not write it, and that isn't writing it down on a post-it note and sticking it underneath their keyboard or in an Excel spreadsheet that they accidentally drop onto their SharePoint, but actually in a proper paid-for solution. Or even at worse, you know, the free things that come with Google and Safari and Internet Explorer and Edge, those built-in password managers, but a proper secure vault where potentially you could share passwords if there's a group password or something. They're and again protected by MFA. They're important things to try and get into place. Yeah, monitor your sign-ins and not just account lockouts. So I think this is another interesting one. A lot of people get hung up on you know, account lockouts and, you know, attacks on people's accounts, and yeah, you know, we've got 6 bad passwords, and then we lock that account out for half an hour a day or until the admin unlocks it. But really, what you need to be careful of is successful accounts, unusual successful logins, because bad actors know that you've got an account lockout policy in place. So, and again, with these nation state ones where they've got all the time in the world, they know that if there's 6 bad attempts, they'll do a password spraying attack with 5 passwords. And then they'll try another user with another 5 passwords. So they'll never breach the 6 bad attempts and then cause a lockout. So it's kind of invisible to you. But really what you should be doing is using some sort of advanced threat protection system that can detect that, you know, Darren logs in from this Windows machine or this MacBook or this phone or between these sorts of times of day from these sorts of IP addresses or geolocations, and that is normal behavior between these sorts of times. But if Darren suddenly logs in successfully from a Linux machine at 2 o'clock in the morning in North Korea, then you need to be able to flag that and act upon it. But it's still a successful login, so you wouldn't normally pick that up. But that's a very important piece of the security puzzle, to baseline your users' behavior, the devices that they use, and flag on any strangeness around that behavior, any unusual activity. And then finally on this slide, decommission any out-of-date system. So, yeah, the server's come to, or the service has come to the end of its life. Don't just leave the server there. Take it out. If you've got 2008 R2 servers still in your environment, get rid of them. Microsoft don't support them anymore. There are no security patches for those things anymore. Shut them down, get them replaced, P2V them, and then upgrade them to 2012. Even if you have to go through multiple steps to get you from 2008 to 2012 R2 to 2016 to 2019, you can P2V them. So turn them into virtual machines if they're physical boxes. Test to make sure the software that's still on them still works, but get rid of those old OSs. And if there are old systems that you just haven't got around to decommissioning that yet, decommission them. There's really no need to keep those things around, and they are just a security vulnerability. And obviously disable users that leave the organization and services and all the rest of it. So, what should we do as a security vendor? You know, what should software companies do? Well, ultimately, you know, be transparent with your customers. If you run into problems, you need to let people know. The more you hold back, the less your customers will trust you in the future. So again, this is very, very important, I think, for software companies to take on board. Document and publish your processes, because everything that I've just told you in the last couple of slides is questioning new software vendors, especially when customers are looking for new products, to make sure that all of these processes are documented and available and open to scrutiny. So it's very, very important to get those things published, documented, and updated accordingly as things change. Always perform independent penetration tests, but also do your own penetration tests as well. So as new services come online, test them yourselves. Reach out to companies like George's, RedScan. There are plenty of others as well on the market. I'm sure they offer penetration tests. But again, make sure it's not just testing the cloud-based software solution, but also their own internal services as well. Our developers actually perform war games themselves on their own software, on their own companions or their own colleagues, I should say. So that they test each other's code to destruction to make sure that it's secure. Listen to the security community as a whole. So look for new trends of cyber attack. Make sure that your software doesn't fall into any of those traps that are developing. So always keep an ear to the ground. It's very easy for us, for me to say that coming from a security company, because all of our developers are listening to that sort of information all of the time. But this really reaches out to non-security based products as well. They still have to put security first above everything else when it comes to coming out with those applications that they create. And that, of course, means adapting to any new threats that appear online. So listen to the community, adapt to any new threats immediately or as soon as you can. And then we also peer review our code. So we have at least 2 other developers review other code before it's checked in. I think that's a good practice. Yeah, we do that. And then finally, one of the things that we certainly do at Spec Ops is that we don't outsource any development of our code at all. I've put in here a little sort of without appropriate due diligence. I know some companies do and have to. It really depends on the scale of the company and how big their teams are. So sometimes people have to do that. But we decided that we really want to keep control of our code. We don't want to have it going anywhere outside of our organization. We securely vet all of our employees before they join Spec Ops. And yeah, I think that's, again, good practice to get into. So yeah, if you want to analyze your password information or your password stance inside your organization, you're more than welcome to download a really cool free tool that Spec Ops produces. It's called Spec Ops Password Auditor, and it can scan your users' current password hashes to tell you whether they've been leaked on a 738 million word database. So again, you can start identifying weaknesses in your environment. It also gives you other really good information, like if more than one user is using the same password, all of that kind of stuff. Totally free, no adverts, nothing. You just head over to specopsoft.com, click on Spec Ops Password Auditor, download it, and yeah, we've found that to be a really good tool over the past few months. So yeah, thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
So we're running a little bit over time. Darren, if you want to put that detail in the chat, that'd be good.
Will do.
Sarah,
thanks.
Over to you, please. And you're on mute, Sarah.
Yep, I've just realised that. If someone can do the honours and let me know if that's sharing okay.
Yeah, that's visible.
Cool, thank you. Right, so good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining, and more importantly, staying for my graveyard shift. So my name's Sarah Knowles, and I'm one of the principal security consultants here at Nexor. So for those of you who haven't come across Nexor before, we're a UK-based cybersecurity company with over 30 years experience in secure information exchange. So we deliver high assurance cybersecurity solutions to industries such as defence, critical national infrastructure, and finance organisations, as well as providing cyber resilience services to companies of all sizes and sectors. So a little bit about me. I've worked in IT for probably a little bit over 25 years now, with the last 19 or so in the information or cybersecurity space. I've worked across a lot of different sort of business verticals, both in private and public sectors. And I generally concentrate on information governance, risk and compliance within a client's organisation. And this basically is to ensure that both their business and security objectives align with each other. And generally I work with organisations to implement cyber resilience services, and this is anything from readiness checks and assessments for certification such as Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001, to risk assessments, to incident management and business continuity. So I've only got a sort of a short window to go through what we as administrators can learn from the SolarWinds attack and do what we can to mitigate against further attacks. So this is going to be quite a sort of a high level run through, but obviously as I say, we've got the Q&A and we'll go through these after I've finished my slides. So are the bad guys winning? I mean, we just need to look at the news, and you know, even mainstream media these days is covering sort of cyber attacks, and you know, and these are just a small selection from the last couple of weeks, and this is the BBC that's just covering this, so you know, everybody gets to see these sorts of stories, and obviously, I say there's more than this, but I'm just putting a small handful on. But basically, it kind of leads us to think that as administrators, the world's on fire, which is obviously not a good place to be. So I think let's start with acknowledging that the task that's being asked of us is hard. Let's not beat around the bush. So Kieran Martin, who is the former head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, sort of agrees with this. This is his view, and this is something he tweeted. I think it was shortly after the SolarWinds attack was first publicised. And basically here he's saying that it's unrealistic for private organisations to have the resource to be able to defend against a nation state attack. So what can we do? Well, my plan is I'm hoping for that lottery win, and I'm going to retire off to a nice private desert island. In the meantime, probably have to be a little bit more realistic, and we need to come up with appropriate ways of battling those fires. So we need to start with the basics, and going back to Kieran Martin, here's another tweet of what he said, and what does he mean by what he's put on this tweet here. So for the majority of organisations, you're probably unlikely to be the direct target of a state-sponsored attack. Not impossible, but definitely unlikely. However, it's more likely that you're going to be sort of the collateral damage of an attack, as seen in SolarWinds, and probably even more likely than that is that you're going to be the target, either again intentionally or accidentally, of a somewhat less resourced hacker. And yeah, we tend to call these sort of commodity attacks. And as I think George briefly touched on the recent Microsoft Exchange hack, that's a vulnerability that was discovered by one group of attackers. They've exploited it, and then others have jumped on with their own versions of their own exploits, and so on. And so organisations are trying to defend against all sorts of things. So again, key things we need to remember: this attack was highly sophisticated. The attackers are from a very well-resourced state-sponsored group. And when we're saying well-resourced, the current estimates are that their head count is well over 1,000 people. As administrators, we can't, it's impossible for us to completely reduce the risk. We can't make the risk of these attacks go away, not possible. So there's always going to be what we call residual risk. And basically, each organisation needs to reduce their risk level to a level that they're happy to live with. And like I say, that's going to vary from business to business. But also, there are also many other attacks from other threat actors that we have to protect against as well. And statistics show that just by implementing controls in something as simple as Cyber Essentials, we can mitigate anywhere between 70 and 90% of commodity attacks that are out in the wild. So again, what does this mean? So we need to prepare for the worst. We have to assume that a breach is going to happen to us at some point, but then acknowledge that we can take steps which will help us defend against this. So we can reduce the likelihood that we're going to become infected. We can reduce how far malware can travel within our organization, and we can reduce the overall impact that an infection can have. Okay, so where do we start? I'll admit, I know this is sort of the Quizzy Mondays on BBC Two slot, but this is not a question from Only Connect. So I'll just caveat that. But yeah, okay, going back to what we need to do, we need to put the odds in our favour. You know, these are our networks, these are our infrastructures, these are our people. So we need to have the home advantage. So you've probably seen some form of this sort of knowledge matrix in the past. But the problem we've got at the minute is that a lot of organisations are kind of on these two left-hand boxes, and especially after the last 12 months and like the rapid move to home working because of COVID, our network boundaries have expanded. We've lost sight of what we're in control of, and the attackers know this, and they're using that information. They're using our own blind spots against us. So we have to move, you know, from that box on the two left-hand side, we need to move them across to the right. So how do we do this? Well, we need to increase our knowledge. So, like I say, this is a very sort of high-level view of what we need to go through, but these are the key areas that we need to have an understanding of. So we need to know what our infrastructure looks like. We need to know where our network boundaries are. This is more than likely going to include a lot more home workers than we were previously used to. We need to know what assets we have, and this includes physical assets and data assets. We need to know the devices that our users are using to access our business data. And do we even know where all of our business data is stored? And then, you know, finally, we need to come and have that understanding of who our threats are, who is likely to attack us. And say, don't forget that we need to consider the insider threats. And these may not be malicious, could be completely accidental, could be just somebody allowing their kids to use their laptop for school homework. So, okay, we know this, we've worked out what we need to know. We need to work out what that means for our business. And we do this by means of a risk assessment. Now, there's many different methodologies out there. Some are better suited to certain types of risk than others. But the important thing is to find a way that works for your business and make sure you use it. So this is a particular risk methodology that I've designed for use with the clients that I work with. And this kind of scales well to whatever is being assessed. So you can sort of keep it right at that high level of looking at what those sort of business risks are, or you can drill it right down into a component level, sort of a deep dive look under the bonnet at a specific component part. But the method's the same. And the typical risk methodology, we identify. We identify the context of what we're assessing, and we carry out the appropriate assessment or a combination of those assessments. We then assess the risk using our organisation's risk framework, and we come up with a list of our threats and the level of risk that they pose to our organisations. And this is going to be your red, amber, greens, your high, medium, lows, whatever your matrix is. We then populate our risk registers with this information. And then basically come up with an appropriate risk mitigation or treatment plan. And this is how we're going to make this risk into something smaller that we're willing to accept. Remember, I said earlier on, we can't make the risk go away altogether. We can only reduce it to a risk that we can live with. Okay, so we've done our risk assessments. We can go back to our knowledge matrix. We know what our risks are. We know what controls we need to put in place, whether that's related to people, process, or technology, or a combination of those. And basically, we're moving over to that right-hand side. And it's important to note that although we may not have all of the answers to our questions, we hopefully at least know what those questions are, which is certainly better than we were at the beginning of the process. So, okay, great, done. Put our feet up, start thinking about that desert island again. No, sorry. The problem we've got is that there's no endpoint. So the previous sort of image we had of the knowledge matrix is technically incorrect. And really what we need is a continual sort of process. So we have to bear in mind the threat landscape is constantly changing, so we need to keep changing with it. Once we think we know that we know everything, there'll be a new attack comes out that we don't know about, and we need to start over. So as businesses, we need to make sure that we keep repeating this process and making sure that we're in the best place to stop the next threat. So sort of to summarise, stopping the state-sponsored attacks is hard. You know, I'm not going to sugarcoat that in any other way. But so we need to know where our crown jewels are. We need to know what our assets are. You know, we need to make sure that we understand what we're looking after. We then need to risk assess to determine what's important to us, and then basically we put those sort of risk treatments in place. So you know, we have to have defence in depth, and there's a reason I sort of finish on this point. And you know, on the previous talks, you know, we've heard in the news, we can't just tag SolarWinds as a supply chain attack. I mean, it is, but it's more than that. So if you think the US, you know, the Department of Defense, they will probably spend far more than any commercial organization will on supply chain risk management. You know, they're going to have a very comprehensive program in place, but they were still compromised. There's been no update released from that organization saying that that supply chain process has broken down. So I think the conclusion we can draw from that is that their supply chain risk management process worked as expected, but they were still breached. So and you know, it's something that Darren touched on as well. You know, we need that defense in depth. You know, we need to make sure that we've got plenty of layers in place that are going to sort of stop these attacks. So we need to make sure that our backups are where they need to be, our patching, our anti-malware software, our access control, you know, multi-factor authentication, incident management, incident response, business continuity, things like our user awareness programs. And again, bearing in mind where our users are now, we need to just expand that out from just being in the office. Our users probably still aren't back in physical offices now, they're still working at home. So again, that realization that you know, your network perimeter is not once what it was. You know, it's moved, it's out in the houses now. You know, can you put in additional technical controls? You know, network segmentation, zero trust is certainly something that's really sort of starting to come through in sort of network deployment. So you know, we need to think about things like this. So, but like I said at the very beginning, this is a very high level view of everything that we can do as administrators. As I say, it's hard, there's no silver bullet, and kind of we've got to be prepared for the next attack. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Right, let's invite George and Darren to turn on their cameras as we begin the Q&A session. We've got a number of questions lined up. If you have any more questions, please submit them into the Q&A panel right away. Okay, the first question is from Andrew, and that is for Darren. Will Microsoft operating systems ever be secure in the sense that Unix was even 30 years ago? Should we abandon Microsoft operating systems in favor of Linux or Unix?
That's more of a question, I think, for your business than for us to decide on. It's and I was looking through some of the other questions that we've got here. For me, ultimately, you know, our companies are there to sell products or provide services, and if you can't find applications or line of business systems that work on those other platforms, you're stuck with what they can work on, and most of that time is the most popular systems, which is Microsoft servers or Azure or AWS. They've all got vulnerabilities. You've just got to be diligent about what you choose, and diligent about who supplies you. Ultimately, it's not easy, as Sarah said. You can't protect yourself from everything all of the time. There will always be vulnerabilities on whatever platform you have. So yeah, I don't necessarily think you should give one up for another. They're all vulnerable ultimately.
Okay, thank you, Darren. On the subject of vulnerability, a question for George. You mentioned CCleaner, that vulnerability. Has that been resolved now?
Yes, yeah, I think this happened. I think it was some many years ago, and it was eventually resolved after the supply chain attack had finished. But again, just like SolarWinds, it impacted a great deal of people, but the threat actor only targeted a very small number of those actually affected by the supply chain attack. So yeah, my understanding is it's all been fixed, but again, another really good example of a supply chain attack.
Okay, great. Next question is for Darren from A. Walker. So if 33,000 customers were using Orion, but only 18,000 of them had updated during the affected timeframe, the 15,000 who didn't update for more than a year were ironically safe from this attack.
Yes, it's quite kind of perverse, really, isn't it? But yeah, unfortunately, well, fortunately for them, that's absolutely correct. But you know, we have to be pragmatic. You never know what form an attack's going to be, and normally companies release patches to patch vulnerabilities. So yes, in this particular circumstance, absolutely, updating to the latest version did put you at risk. But usually, and you think of all the patches that you apply every week to every system that you have, how many thousands of those actually solve problems? So yeah, I don't think it's an excuse. That one example of where it actually backfired isn't really the rule that you should work to. It's still very important to make sure things are patched and up to date.
Okay, great. All right, we haven't got any questions for Sarah at the moment, so if you've got something, send it our way. All right, next one is for George from Paul. If Microsoft code has been read or transferred out of Microsoft, can we assume that additional vulnerabilities in the code will be exploited by this threat actor?
Yes, that is a very good assumption to make. We know that these guys have a lot of people working for them, some very good reverse engineers. I think it's safe to assume that yes, there will be some new 0 days that are going to be found in Microsoft products. I also think that would happen anyway. I think that the recent Exchange vulnerabilities, both proxy logon and the stuff that was released by the NSA, I think last week and patched in last week's Patch Tuesday, are examples of that there will always be vulnerabilities in things because they're made by people. So people will make mistakes.
Okay, thanks. All right. We've got an anonymous question here, and we're not sure who to send it to, so it's open to all of you. Due to the sophistication and success of the SolarWinds attack, do you foresee future equally sophisticated attacks which go beyond espionage and target critical civilian infrastructure similar to those in Ukraine and Estonia?
Yes, would be my short answer to that. I'll let George and Sarah elaborate.
Well, no, again, I don't think I can add much more to that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, you know, sort of, it's like now that's been established as, oh yeah, that method of attacks worked. Of course, more people are going to do it. So yeah, I think absolutely we'll be seeing a lot more of those, you know, these types of attack in the future. Yeah,
I mean, I think if this particular attack wasn't discovered when it was, almost by accident, there's a lot of groundwork that these attackers did to enable them to go on to do those sorts of attacks. using the access that they had from this one. So I think really kind of got a bit lucky here. And so yeah, there's a lot of groundwork laid, and I do think this is going to happen. Yes.
And let's face it, a lot of companies won't even learn from these attacks, will they? They'll carry on with their bad practice, and it's easy. It should be simple for these people to repeat exactly this attack into other software companies. Maybe not quite so large, but yeah.
And it's the point I made sort of quite early on around, it's not even at this level of attacks as well. You know, by not doing the basics, even sort of simple attacks are working against organisations. So yeah, it's. I think we're just going to be seeing a lot more of it in the future.
Very good, thank you. Right, next question is from Matthew, and that's for Darren. To what extent can all of these system admin tasks be automated, or is it even more dangerous trusting AI tools, etc.?
Well, yeah, a lot of this is very difficult to automate against because it's new threats all the time. So a lot of it is about training of your admins and training what to look out for. Sure, you can use tools to try and detect bad behavior, like Spec Password Auditor, for instance, but there are many other tools out there. A lot of companies, a lot of penetration testing companies produce automated tests, but you'll always find that the manual testing is much more expensive, but also much more effective, because they will always be trying out more creative methods than can be automatically programmed. As for remediation, yeah, you've really got to look at what you've got in your environment and try to automate things as much as possible, just to try and reduce your workload. But again, that's not an easy task. It really has to be judged on a system by system basis.
Okay, thanks. Right, we've actually hit 2030, and we've got a couple of questions remaining, but if you do need to drop, feel free to do so, and we'll just work through these final two questions. All right, the next question is from Trevor, and he quotes Darren. Assume breach, hunt and evict. Should this even be when patching now, or regular patching?
I don't know. You still need to patch. Ultimately, I would say maybe you should, certainly for patching operating systems, I think is critical. It's probably too difficult to review every single release note about what a patch is actually supposed to be doing for an operating system. If you're updating applications, absolutely, I think you should review the release notes to find out what changes have been made, and think about how those changes might impact how you've implemented that particular piece of software. I always encourage anyone who's updating our own solutions to make sure that they've read the release notes and are prepared to see what impact that might have in their environment. So, you know, even if it's something that might seem small, so introducing the ability to send out an email notification, or, you know, understand where those things are going to be, where those changes are going to be made, what systems are going to be sending those notifications, stuff like that. Just think about it. Think about what you're introducing whenever you install or upgrade your applications and services.
Actually, can I just add just something onto that? And this has just come out of the Cyber Essentials scheme, and they're releasing a new version, I think in the next few weeks, and they are going to be looking at one of the criteria is going to be for automatic updates to be applied where possible. Now, obviously, they're not expecting you to apply sort of patches to your server infrastructure, because again, that's probably a bad thing to do. But it's certainly on your your end user pieces of kit. Yeah, they're going to be looking for automatic updates. So the message that's coming from NCSC, patching is still key.
Agreed.
Very good. Okay. All right, so final question from Paul. Over the years, businesses have pushed to connect all systems onto the network. Should we be disconnecting systems again? thinking especially of control systems.
Well, there is an argument if it's not connected, it can't be attacked.
Yeah,
but
there's also an argument. Yeah,
you also need to be able to use your systems to, you know, to run your business. So again, with my governance hat on, my view is you need to risk assess those systems and work out what controls you need to put in place. You know, do you need additional firewalls? Do you need that network segmentation? You know, there's a lot of sort of technical issues or technical controls that you can put in place to protect those sorts of systems. But yeah, you know, as I say, it's getting that balance, and you've got to look at what's right for your business.
Yeah, I agree. I think you ultimately it's a business decision. If they need that application to perform their work and it has to be connected to the internet somehow, who are you to stand in their way? All you can do is really make it as safe as it possibly can be, so that you're assured that it's not going to have any negative impacts. But again, as Sarah said, you can't just assume that's going to be the case forever after day one of implementation. You need to constantly review these things and make sure that they haven't been compromised in the future. So any new vulnerabilities, known or unknown.
Totally agree. Monitoring things is very hard. My advice would be to, if it's connected to your network, in some way monitor it. I'm reminded of the time a Vegas casino was owned by I think it was a thermometer in a fish tank.
Yeah.
Does that need to be connected to the internet? Maybe, maybe not. That's up to the organization to decide, but finding a way of putting some monitoring around that particular solution, protecting it efficiently, you need to decide if the additional workload is worth it to have the ability to control that from a remote location somewhere.
Great. Well, thank you very much to everyone. I'm going to hand back to Paul.
Yes, thank you very much for all of our speakers and the audience participants for submitting their questions. So I found it a very useful session. Colin, is there any final words from you before we close?
No, just like to thank the three speakers. Again, I think it was a very informative sort of session, and I'm sure it's one we'll return to, because one way or the other, this is a game changer, because as Sarah highlighted, we can't deal with all the risks. There are going to be open risks, and so new processes, new techniques, new things to try, new ways of dealing with it are going to come to market in the coming years. And so yeah, it's a topic we're going to return to many times, I suspect.
So we'll close the session now. So both from the BCS and CIISec, we mentioned we've got our events published on our respective websites. So thank you very much for joining this evening, and good night.